So I'll be discussing something that I call the curl and skew generator. My name is Nicholas Solem. I'm a PhD student currently at the University of California, San Diego. So basically the CSG is a virtual instrument available as an audio unit and VST. Started off actually as a max patch that I programmed using the Gen environment. So basically the design philosophies I think are quite heretical. It's basically hypocrisy and contradiction in the synthesis method, or at least it's one realization of this to me. And with this instrument, I wanted to collapse the distinctions between, for instance, digital precision and analog instability, real-time arithmetic process versus lookup table access, and pitched/harmonic versus noisy and inharmonic. So some of the, I basically thought of these what I call DSP Counter-Dogmas in order to realize a lot of the goals with this instrument. This is not really an exhaustive list of what DSP Counter-Dogmas could be, but it's kind of the set that this set came about both from designing the instrument and then also when I was finished designing the instrument, kind of reminding myself of what I did in that process. So I kind of, the list kind of evolved with the instrument is what I'm trying to say. So this list consists of, 0 through 4. So unpredictability, adversity enhancement, error interdependence, paradoxical waveshaping, and drone. All right? So basically this is kind of a, you could say, schematic of the instrument, of the CSG. We're gonna kind of go back to this a bit throughout, but basically we've got two main segments, you could say, two main blocks. There's the frequency modulation side and the phase modulation side. You might be saying to yourself, well, you can implement phase modulation via frequency modulation, and that's true. But I kind of thought of them in different ways. So this segment is affecting the frequency of our phasor, which is basically the boss of everything. The phasor is really the only driving force really of everything. There's no other oscillator. It's a single oscillator voice in the end. So yeah, this segment is literally influencing the frequency of that phasor. Whereas this segment is basically doing some shaping of that phasor and then being summed into a sine function. Okay? And let's see. So yeah, so the phasor comes into a bit crusher to basically reduce the fidelity of that phasor. So the classic thing to do would be just you run the phasor into the sine, and now you have a perfect sine wave oscillator, right? But by doing this, we kind of have a almost stepped sine wave oscillator. But it's not, you'll see it's not quite a stepped sine wave even. And then this feedback loop effectively changes that effective output. Actually, it's almost like a sine to sawtooth wave shaper. And by the way, with all of this, I'm not claiming that I'm the first person to do any of these things. It's just the package that I put them in and the way that they all interact together becomes its own unique instrument. But for instance, in the DX series of synthesizers, there already was frequency modulation and feedback loop that you could do with the operators. But there wasn't this weird bit crushing, for instance. And then there's a delay line here, so we're going to talk about all these things in a little more detail. But and then there's a smoothing function to kind of tame that feedback a little bit. And then, so that's the frequency modulation side. Then here, we are also getting a sinusoidal output from that phasor at the same time as a different phase output. So they're both sinusoidal, just different phases. And then we are basically weighting the two different phases here, and then another bit crusher, another smoothing function, and this effective sinusoidal output is then summed with that phasor, and it becomes a phase modulation side, which actually gets you very similar results to wave folders, for instance, the Buchla wave folder. I haven't confirmed if it's really the same, but it's very similar sounding at least. So let's go through these principles a little bit and see how the instrument really realizes them. So unpredictability is basically feedback paths allow for timbral complexity, often in unpredictable ways. I think we've seen quite a bit of this at this conference. But so there are two independent feedback paths in the CSG. There's the frequency modulator path, FM path, and then actually there's a state variable filter, which I didn't show in this because it's kind of after it. And really that's, I would say, maybe it's not absolutely essential to the instrument, but I wanted actually two extra dimensions to the instrument that the state variable filter provides. So I know it's not so heretical to have a filter after this, after you have your funny thing going on, but the state variable filter that I implemented is a little weird because this is what a linear state variable filter would look like. So all the outputs of it are intertwined. So the high pass, this basically is a resonance control, and you basically obtain the high pass from this function. And then the derivative of the band pass output is the cutoff frequency times the low pass output here. And then the derivative of the low pass output is the cutoff frequency times the band pass output. However, it's a little bit too predictable, a little bit too static and stale. So I made it nonlinear. And it wasn't in any kind of genius way where I did a circuit analysis and tried to figure out, oh, what's the exact thing going on? It's more like, oh, let's just put a tan H on there. And it gives us, it gives a much more interesting results just by doing that, actually. Because what happens is you can analyze it as though when you have a high amplitude signal, the cutoff frequency instantaneously lowers because the tan H is a limiting function. So so we'll hear that as you turn the resonance up, it gets very unstable, not in the sense that it blows up to infinity, but in the sense that the timbral the sounds that you get are very moving constantly. They're just constantly changing. Okay, so then, and also I know I said that there are two things in unpredictability. The second one, though, we're going to see that analyzed more in this first rule. So adversity enhancement. If a problem could be engineered away, seek instead to enhance it into a functional parameter. So in implementing the FM feedback path, it was necessary, well, kind of necessary to calculate the output sample in order to add that output value into the input, into the phase increment input. So an ideal solution would analytically be able to resolve the instantaneous frequency calculation on a sample-by-sample basis. Basically what I mean is that you have the output simultaneous to the input, and that would be a perfect feedback system, right? But in practice, most digital implementations of feedback merely add a unit delay, so that you can just use the previous sample as as part of the current input. And my solution was actually just to not only keep that unit delay, but to parameterize it, to make it a variable, which I called history in this instrument. So yeah, so we're going to hear this soon. It'll be exciting. But then another thing that's within this first rule is that in implementing digital delays, a very common method is by using a circular delay where you pre-allocate a buffer and you only change the indices, the read and write pointers, and you basically wrap the data around that buffer and you only change the points where you're reading and writing. But I made a mistake when I was first coding this. I accidentally made two ways at which it sort of resets the read and write pointers. One was based on the entire array's ending, which is the right thing to do, but the other one was based on the effective delay length's ending, which is not so good. So here's just a snapshot of the original code doing that. And another thing that I'm not so sure, it's probably not the right thing to do, is that I used fmod f, which is for floating point data, but delay time is in samples, which is an integer amount. And since the parameter itself is a float, there was maybe some other funny thing going on that I haven't really analyzed, but that's okay. So this solved the problem when I just commented out those extra reset things. But then it became a little bit too predictable because what ended up happening is that when you change that delay time in the feedback loop, you kind of get, well, say that you have just a unit sample delay. You basically get this extra very high frequency energy close to Nyquist. And as you increase the delay time, that energy kind of moves back in a correlated way based on the delay time that of that feedback path. So that's kind of it was a little bit boring, to be honest. So what did I do? I uncommented it. I broke it again. So I have two different resets for those pointers, and I don't entirely know how that how it's doing things. Maybe I should look into that more, but yeah, that was my solution for now. So now the second rule or counter-dogma is while bit reduction sometimes sits as an effect towards the end of a signal chain, here digital error plays an interdependent role within feedback loops. So I've never really been that much of a fan of bit crushing because I think that the results can be a little bit too blatant a lot of the time, a little bit obvious. But an exception has, well, this is kind of a side note. I do like the early 12-bit samplers, but that's more because it's, I don't know, there's something authentic about the fact that they have 12-bit DACs, and you can't change that. That's just the sound of it. But anyway, so yeah, the having the bit crushing at the end of a signal chain is a little bit boring to me. But when you put it inside of a feedback loop, it becomes a totally different beast. So this is this very simple bit crushing function. Just you have a fractional value, you amplify it by some large amount, and then you make it only integers, and then you divide it by that large amount so that you still have the same range at the end. And depth in this function is not actually bit depth, technically. It's just the discrete number of data values that it's allowed to take. So CSG uses two of these bit crushers, one in the FM feedback path and one in the feed-forward phase modulation path. But in the feed-forward path, it ends up being part of the other feedback path because it's all intertwined. To me, the most interesting side effect is that we don't actually obtain just a bit crush waveform. We instead get a discrete, we kind of get these mini sawtooths. And I think this would be a good point to just show what I'm talking about. So compile. So already, if we degrade the, oh, sorry. Okay. So if we degrade this FM path, But if we now start introducing some of this FM, and then do that, okay, and then another thing is this.
Maybe you could turn it down just a little bit to get the balance between your speech and
Sure. So then there's this smoothing function. So right now the cutoff frequency is at 2K, but if we increase it, it gets out of control a little bit. And that also is dependent, like everything is basically intertwined, interdependent. Okay. So, yeah, so you kind of see that it's not just a literal bit crushing at the end of the day, because it's in that feedback path. Okay, point 3 is paradoxical waveshaping. Paradoxically, the same tools for generating the cleanest possible waveform are used here in order to produce a timbrally rich, distorted sound. So basically, the schematic uses 2 sine and 1 cosine function, and obviously, well, maybe not to everyone, but maybe to us, sinusoidal waves are the only waves that only include 1 harmonic. They're the only pure waveform. However, by placing these functions in series, in other words, putting a sinusoidal wave into a sinusoidal wave shaper, we get these rich overtones. And this is further enhanced by having a parallel path. And what I'm talking about is the fact that we have the sine and cosine part. It actually makes a significant difference. Okay, so if we bring this back, and so if I introduce the PM amount, which is phase modulation amount, that is effectively, that is this, well, there's basically a multiplier that I guess I'm not showing. Oh, no, it's this preamp here, that multiplier. So when we increase this, yeah, and by bit crushing that is where it gets even more exciting. Back the FM path, it just becomes kind of its own, it has a life of its own more so, I would say. Yeah. How much time do we have? What's that? Wait, we're not over, I hope.
-5.
You're kidding. Okay, I'll hurry. Okay, the last one is drone. So this is something that I think we all maybe take for granted because we use dedicated computer music software as opposed to standard digital audio workstations. So with, I think most electronic music producers who use DAWs, this is how they would need to make a drone. Is they just have a very long MIDI note, and they do that. So the ARC Odyssey synthesizer had this sort of infamous feature where the VCA gain here made it just drone on and on forever, and people thought that it was broken. It wouldn't stop making sound. So basically, I wanted a feature that does that. So that is this drone here. So without it, if I play a note, this envelope is working. But if we have a blend of the drone, then it's always slightly sounding. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not so sure that that's exactly heretical, but it's definitely not part of most DAW-based instruments, I don't think. Yeah. Just another point about battling associations. FM has been perceived as cheesy a lot of the time, but not very often has it been thought of as giving you these out-of-control sounds. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a comment from KVR. It was probably partly in jest. But CSG technically maybe does FM, but not exactly, because it uses only one operator to obtain everything. And also, it has this history parameter, which we haven't even looked at yet. And this makes it very difficult to tame in a way, unless you don't make use of some of the functionality of it. So let's just take a look at that parameter, which is the delay in the feedback path. So this is the amount of samples of delay in that feedback. It can just do its own thing. And also, I didn't show the filter either. So here's the filter, and you can see what I mean about how the nonlinearity makes it very important. So when I increase the resonance, yeah, it does that kind of thing. And it also has multi-mode, so you can change the left and right filter type.
Now we couldn't really hear what you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. You can change the filter type independently on the left and right speaker. So right now it's low pass on the left and high pass on the right. So you can do some interesting stereo effects. And then the last thing is that it has one low frequency oscillator, because it's free, and I think that I shouldn't have to give you too many features. So one LFO. And so this is your one LFO, and you can send it to any parameter. There's a few that don't work exactly as I want yet, but yeah. And you can change the shape of the LFO and the speed.
And how does the shape of the LFO change with that?
It just linearly interpolates between triangle to sawtooth to square to sine. Yeah. So here's sine. Here's square. Here's saw. Here, I'll make it square. And then here's triangle. And yeah, that's basically the instrument. And yeah, I mentioned that it's free. And what I mean by that is actually that you have to compile it for yourself. But here's the GitHub where you can download it. And you need to download both the CSG and the NKVDU libraries folders, and then it's all in Juice. That's what I used to design the instrument. So I think you don't need to download Juice. I think if you just have these, it should, in theory, compile untested. But email me if it doesn't, and we'll try to figure it out. Yeah.
Are those libraries mentioned in the GitHub page?
They should be the first thing that you see on the GitHub. Yeah, on that link.
Okay.
Yes. Can I take any questions?
No.
Could you still show the link?
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Questions?
Questions?
Well,
What controls the filter?
It's supposed to be the LFO. Actually, what I wanted to do, which I didn't have time to do, was make the envelope control the filter, not the LFO. And then I wanted to make the envelope loopable, since you already have it droning, but I haven't done that quite yet. So the filter might be updated in a few days, or sorry, the code might be updated in a few days to allow for that. Right now, it's supposed to be the LFO, but it's not quite working. So, yeah. Yes.
What is the magic of applying floating point number for the delay time in the delay
yes.
time? Yeah.
What is the magic? Well, I think kind of what happens is that, say it's at 15.3 samples back.
Yeah.
Then the
Rounding?
What's that?
Rounding? Maybe?
Well, what will happen is if it's gone past that, it'll start back at 0.3, or it'll try to start back at 0.3. I'm actually not entirely sure I can fully answer that right now, but something weird happens that's different than if, like when you use fractional values of the delay time, it does something a little bit different than if you only use integer values.
So,
and I'm not entirely sure.
that's something that's happening inside Juice, is it?
Yeah,
Juice
fix
that for you.
It's all my own libraries in terms of the like the DSP stuff going on.
So, I mean, what if you convert the fractional part of delay time as into a phase shift?
Into a phase shift? Do you mean
like interpolating? Like I didn't.
Oh,
yeah.
I think. I'm definitely interested in trying that. What's going on now is actually that it takes the sample of delay and also the one before it and takes the difference between the two.
Yeah. That's a linear interpolation then, presumably.
Well, it's actually not even an interpolation because it's the difference instead of a weighted average. It's actually the difference between the two. Because I wanted to kind of take a pseudo derivative in order to not skew too far away from the fundamental frequency. Because otherwise it gets too out of control, I would say.
Why not?
Yeah.
Is there a max patch still available?
Oh, good question. It started as a max patch, but it's not available online. I could see if I could put it online, or at least if you email me, I can send it.
I think we need the emails. Yeah, I guess I can list.
Yeah.
At least. Heretical.
Is that right? Yes, that's my email address. There you go.
Now, the Wendy, Nicholas was suggested that if we should share our email links from the group.
Yeah,
we may
that'd
have
be great.
other.
Okay, yes. Well, we need people's permission for that, but maybe I can organise that then.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, no
But
further questions?
No.
Right.